Static crackled through the tower at Bagram Airfield like the voice of something already dead. Major Kyle Henson pressed the headset tighter against his skull, leaning forward over the console as if proximity might sharpen the signal into clarity. The words came broken, distorted by distance and damage, but the call sign cut through clean. Widow 7. Engines failing. Hydraulics gone. Then nothing. Just the hiss of empty frequency and the collective held breath of everyone in that control room. Outside, the Hindu Kush mountains stood like silent witnesses under a sky turning the color of old bruises. Henson exchanged glances with his team. Widow 7 was Captain Nadia Voss, and if the rumors were true, she was flying on borrowed time and shredded metal 30,000 feet above hostile ground. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, that ugly warthog of close air support, was already a relic to some. But Voss flew it like scripture, and now that scripture was coming apart in midair. The morning had started routine, almost boring. Voss had launched at 0500 with her wingman, Carlson Gator 2-1, for what should have been a textbook combat air patrol over the Helmand province. Intelligence reported scattered insurgent activity, nothing that warranted alarm. The A-10s were there to provide overwatch for a convoy moving through a narrow pass, where roadside bombs had turned dirt into graveyards more than once. Voss checked in every 15 minutes, her voice calm and professional, almost bored. She described the landscape below in shorthand: brown hills, dry riverbeds, two technicals moving north. Gator 2-1 confirmed visual. Everything was clockwork until it wasn't. The first indication came at 0742. Gator 2-1 reported small arms fire, sporadic and inaccurate. Voss acknowledged, adjusted altitude. Then came the sound nobody wants to hear, the low thump of something larger, something meant to kill aircraft. A shoulder-fired missile, probably a Stinger left over from decades of proxy wars, lanced upward from a ridgeline disguised by morning shadows. Voss saw it a half-second before impact. She broke hard left, released flares, and for a moment it seemed like the missile would chase the decoys. It didn't. The warhead detonated just behind her starboard engine, and the A-10 shuddered like a living thing taking a bullet to the spine. Alarms screamed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the canopy in dark streaks. Gator 2-1 was shouting coordinates, calling for SAR, but Voss was already fighting a plane that no longer wanted to fly. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for people who hadn't spent 2 tours over Fallujah and another over Kandahar. Panic was for pilots who hadn't grown up in a town so small it didn't have a traffic light, where her father, a crop duster with a drinking problem, taught her that machines were honest, that they'd tell you exactly when they were dying if you listened close enough. Voss listened now. The starboard engine was gone, belching black smoke and grinding metal. The port engine was running hot, temperature gauges climbing into the red. Hydraulics were failing, which meant the flight controls were turning into suggestions rather than commands. She had maybe 10 minutes before the aircraft became a 17-ton glider with all the aerodynamic grace of a falling refrigerator. The radio crackled again. Gator 2-1, Widow 7, say status. Voss keyed the mic, her voice steady despite the chaos. I'm flying on hope and spite. Hydraulics are shot. I'm bleeding fuel and altitude, heading 270, trying to make it back. There was a pause, then Gator's voice quieter. You're 60 miles out. 60 miles. It might as well have been 60 light years. In the tower, Henson was already coordinating. He alerted the crash crews, the medical teams, everyone who would need to be ready when Voss made it back. But there were doubts. The A-10 was tough, legendarily so, but there were limits even to legend. He pulled up her service record on the screen, scanning it quickly. Captain Nadia Voss, 34 years old, 12 years in service, over 2,000 flight hours in the A-10. Decorations included 2 distinguished flying crosses and a Purple Heart from a mission in 2019 where she'd taken shrapnel in the shoulder but still brought her wingman home. The word widowed appeared in her file, a notation from 3 years prior. Her husband, an Army Ranger, killed in action during a night raid outside Mosul. No children. No next of kin listed except a brother in Montana. Henson closed the file. It felt like reading an obituary that hadn't been published yet. Voss worked the problem with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent years training for the worst. She shut down the dying starboard engine, cutting fuel to prevent fire. The port engine was her only hope now, and she bobbied it, adjusting throttle with the delicacy of a surgeon. The flight controls were sluggish, responding seconds late to her inputs, and she could feel the airframe vibrating in ways it wasn't designed to. The A-10 was built to take punishment, its titanium bathtub cockpit designed to withstand ground fire, its redundant systems meant to keep flying even when logic said it shouldn't. But redundancy only went so far. She'd lost primary hydraulics, backup hydraulics, and now the manual reversion system was all that stood between controlled flight and a ballistic tumble into the mountains below. Her hands ached from gripping the stick. Sweat ran down her spine despite the cold at altitude. She glanced at the fuel gauge. It was dropping faster than it should, which meant she had a leak somewhere in the system. She did the math in her head. Current fuel burn rate, distance to Bagram, wind conditions. It was going to be close, too close. Gator 2-1 stayed with her, flying formation off her port wing, as if proximity alone could keep her in the sky. His real name was Lieutenant Marcus Acaffer, a kid from Houston with a grin that could sell anything and a flying skill that had earned him respect even among the old guard. He kept up a steady stream of encouragement over the radio, his voice a lifeline in the static. "You're doing great, Widow. Just keep her steady. We're almost home." Voss wanted to believe him. But she'd been flying long enough to know when someone was lying to make you feel better. Acaffer could see the smoke trailing from her aircraft, the uneven thrust, the way she was losing altitude in increments that would add up to disaster. He stayed anyway. That's what wingmen did. Voss keyed the mic. "Gator, if I don't make it, tell them I didn't eject because I'm stubborn, not because I'm brave." Acaffer laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're making it, Captain. No speeches yet." The mountains below were unforgiving, jagged peaks that seemed to reach upward like the fingers of something buried and angry. Voss tried to stay focused on the horizon, on the instruments, on anything except the growing certainty that this might be the last flight. She thought about her husband, about the last time she'd seen him alive. He'd been standing in the doorway of their base housing, wearing his uniform, his rifle slung over one shoulder. He'd kissed her forehead and told her to fly safe. She'd told him to come back whole. Neither of them had kept that promise fully. When the army chaplain knocked on her door 3 weeks later, she'd known before he said a word. The look on his face was the same look every chaplain wore when delivering that news. She'd listened, nodded, signed paperwork, and then she'd gone to the flight line and requested the next combat sortie available. Flying was the only thing that made sense anymore. The only place where cause and effect were clear, where skill mattered, where she could be more than a widow. Back at Bagram, the crash crews were assembling on the taxiway, foam trucks and ambulances lined up like mourners at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. Henson stood outside the tower now, scanning the sky with binoculars. The other pilots had gathered too, a silent crowd of flight suits in concern. In the military, pilots formed a tribe within a tribe, and when one of their own was in trouble, everyone felt it. There were rumors about Voss, the kind that followed female pilots like shadows. Some said she was too aggressive, that she took risks to prove herself. Others said she was the best stick in the squadron, that she flew with a precision that made the A-10 look graceful. Henson had flown with her once years ago, and he remembered her as focused, almost detached, as if she were always calculating angles and outcomes in her head. She didn't socialize much, didn't join the poker games or the bar nights. She flew, she maintained her aircraft, and she disappeared into her quarters. The loneliness of competence, Henson thought, the price of being better than people expected. Voss was 15 miles out now, descending through 8,000 feet, the port engine coughing and sputtering like an old man with pneumonia. The fuel gauge was kissing empty. She could see Bagram in the distance, the runway lights cutting through the haze like a promise. Almost there, almost. But the engine was failing, temperature spiking, oil pressure dropping. She had maybe 2 minutes before it seized completely. She called the tower. "Bagram, Widow 7 on final approach. I'm coming in hot and heavy." "Clear the runway." Henson's voice came back immediately. Widow 7, runway is clear. Emergency crews standing by. You're cleared to land. Voss allowed herself a single, grim smile. Good, because I'm only getting one shot at this. The A-10 was shaking now, the entire airframe protesting every second it stayed airborne. She lowered the landing gear manually, cranking the handle until she felt the locks engage. No hydraulics meant no flaps, which meant she'd be landing fast, too fast. The stall speed on an A-10 with no flaps was north of 130 knots, and she was coming in at 150 with no margin for error. The ground rushed up to meet her. Voss pulled back on the stick, flaring the nose just enough to bleed off speed without stalling. The main gear touched down hard, slamming into the concrete with a screech of tortured metal. The nose gear followed a second later, and then she was rolling, the brakes screaming, smoke pouring from the tires. The aircraft slewed left, then right, and for a terrifying moment it felt like it might tip over. But the A-10 held, ugly and stubborn as ever, and after what felt like an eternity but was only seconds, it came to a shuddering stop 3/4 of the way down the runway. Voss sat in the cockpit, hands still gripping the stick, and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The engine finally quit, coughing once and then going silent. The foam trucks were already rushing toward her, sirens wailing. She popped the canopy and the cold air hit her like a slap. She was alive. Against all odds, against logic and physics and the universe's apparent desire to kill her today, she was alive. Henson reached the aircraft just as Voss was climbing down, moving stiffly, every muscle in her body taut from the strain of the flight. She dropped the last few feet to the tarmac and stood there, staring at the wrecked A-10 behind her. The tail was scorched black, the starboard engine a mangled mess of metal and carbon scoring. Hydraulic fluid pooled beneath the fuselage in dark puddles. It looked like something that should never have flown, let alone landed. Henson approached carefully, giving her space. "Den Voss." She turned, and he saw her face for the first time since she'd landed. There was no relief there, no triumph, just exhaustion and something harder to name, a kind of hollowness. "Major," she said, her voice flat. Henson gestured toward the aircraft. "That shouldn't have been possible." Voss glanced back at the A-10, then back at him. "Tell that to the plane. I just held on." The crash crews were swarming now, inspecting the damage, taking photos, already beginning the accident investigation. A-10 landed a few minutes later, taxiing in fast, and he jogged over to Voss, his face split by a wide grin. He clapped her on the shoulder hard enough to make her wince. "You crazy, magnificent human being, I thought you were dead." Voss shrugged him off, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. "Not yet, Gator, not yet." The pilots who'd gathered to watch began to disperse, talking among themselves, their voices a low murmur. Voss could feel their eyes on her, could sense the shift in how they saw her. Before, she'd been competent, reliable, someone who did the job without fuss. Now she was something else. Now she was the pilot who'd flown a dying A-10 60 miles through hostile airspace and landed it with no hydraulics and one engine. That kind of thing became legend, and legends were heavy. Henson cleared his throat. "You should get checked out by medical." Voss nodded, but she didn't move. She was still staring at the aircraft, at the scars it wore. "I need to debrief," she said finally. "Tell them what happened so it doesn't happen to someone else." Henson respected that. "Tomorrow. Tonight you rest." The debriefing came the next afternoon in a windowless conference room that smelled like stale coffee and printed paper. Voss sat at the head of a long table, facing a panel of officers that included Henson, the squadron commander, and a stern-faced colonel from wing headquarters who'd flown in specifically for this. They listened as she walked them through the mission step by step, from launch to missile strike to landing. She kept her voice even, clinical, describing the failures in technical terms, the decisions she'd made and why. The colonel interrupted occasionally to ask questions, probing for mistakes, for deviations from protocol. Voss answered each one without defensiveness. She knew what this was. They were looking for someone to blame, or at least a lesson to extract. She gave them the truth, which was that sometimes you did everything right and the world still tried to kill you. When she finished, there was silence. The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're aware that ejecting was an option." It wasn't a question, but Voss answered anyway. "Yes, sir." "And you chose not to." I believed I could bring the aircraft home, sir. The colonel's expression didn't change. That aircraft is worth $30 million, Captain. Your life is worth more. Voss met his gaze evenly. With respect, sir, that aircraft was still mission capable. As long as it could fly, it was my job to fly it. The squadron commander, a grizzled lieutenant colonel named Braddock, spoke up. Captain Voss has a point. Ejecting over hostile territory would have put her at significant risk, and we'd have lost the aircraft anyway. The colonel grunted, non-committal. He shuffled his papers, made a note, then looked up again. Your actions likely saved the airframe and prevented it from falling into enemy hands. That will be noted in the report. It was as close to praise as someone like him would give, and Voss took it for what it was. The debriefing ended shortly after. As the officers filed out, Braddock lingered. He waited until the room was empty, then closed the door. Off the record, he said, that was some of the finest flying I've ever heard of. You did good, Voss. Voss looked at him, surprised. Braddock wasn't known for sentiment. Thank you, sir. He nodded, then hesitated as if weighing whether to say more. I knew your husband, briefly. We crossed paths in Iraq in A-10. He spoke about you, said you were the toughest person he knew. The words hit Voss like a punch she hadn't seen coming. She looked away, suddenly unable to meet Braddock's eyes. He exaggerated. I don't think he did, Braddock said quietly. Then he left, and Voss was alone in the conference room, staring at the empty chairs and the half-full coffee cups and the weight of a compliment she didn't know how to carry. Over the next few days, the story spread, not just through Bagram but through the wider Air Force community. Someone leaked the radio recordings, and they went viral within the tight circles of military aviation. Pilots from other squadrons, other bases, even other branches reached out to Voss with messages of respect and congratulations. She ignored most of them. Fame, even small fame, felt uncomfortable, like wearing someone else's uniform. But there was one message she couldn't ignore. It came from her brother Eli, a rancher in Montana who rarely called and never wrote. The email was short. Heard what you did. Dad would have been proud. Hell, I'm proud. Stay safe, Nadia. She read it 3 times, then closed her laptop and sat in the darkness of her quarters, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, more like permission to keep going. The A-10 was grounded for repairs, which meant Voss was temporarily without an aircraft. She spent her days in the squadron building, reviewing mission footage, helping newer pilots with tactics, and avoiding the canteen where people might want to talk to her. Akaffer found her there one afternoon, hunched over a desk covered in flight manuals. You know you're allowed to take a break, right? Voss didn't look up. I'm fine. You're a terrible liar. She glanced at him and he grinned. Come on. Some of us are playing cards tonight. You should join. Voss shook her head. I don't play cards. Akaffer sat on the edge of the desk, undeterred. You don't do anything except fly and brood. It's not healthy. I'm healthy enough, Voss said, returning her attention to the manual. Akaffer was quiet for a moment, then he said, You know the guys talk about you. That got her attention. She looked up, wary. What do they say? That you're the best pilot in the squadron, that you don't give a damn about anything except the mission, that you'd fly into hell if someone told you there was a target there. He paused, and that you're lonely as hell but too stubborn to admit it. Voss felt her jaw tighten. They don't know me. No, Akaffer agreed, but maybe that's the problem. He stood, stretching. Offer stands, canteen 2000 hours, no pressure. He left before she could respond. Voss sat there, staring at the words on the page in front of her, not really seeing them. Lonely. The words stuck in her mind like a splinter. She'd been alone for 3 years now. Ever since the knock on the door, the folded flag, the hollow condolences. She'd chosen to be alone, or at least she'd told herself that. It was easier to fly solo, to keep people at a distance where they couldn't hurt you or leave you or die on you. But maybe Akaffer was right. Maybe solitude had become a habit, and habits could kill you just as surely as missiles. At 2000 hours, she found herself walking toward the canteen. She didn't know why. Maybe because Akaffer's words had gotten under her skin. Maybe because the silence in her quarters was starting to feel less like peace and more like a tomb. The canteen was crowded, loud with laughter and the clatter of trays. She spotted Akafor at a corner table with 3 other pilots, cards spread between them. He saw her and waved her over, his grin widening. "I knew you'd come." Voss pulled up a chair, feeling awkward and out of place. "I'm only staying for one hand." "That's what they all say," one of the other pilots, a captain named Rivera, said with a laugh. They dealt her in, and Voss found herself relaxing just a little. The game was poker, low stakes, more about the banter than the betting. Rivera told a story about a training flight gone wrong. Akafor countered with an even more ridiculous tale, and slowly, incrementally, Voss felt the walls she'd built around herself start to crack. She didn't talk much, but she listened, and that was enough. For the first time in years, she felt like maybe she wasn't just a pilot, just a widow, just a call sign on the radio. Maybe she was still a person. The next morning, Voss was informed that her A-10 was flight-ready again. The maintenance crew had worked miracles, replacing the damaged engine, patching the hydraulic lines, and restoring the airframe to combat status. She walked out to the flight line and stood before the aircraft, running her hand along the fuselage. The scorch marks were still there, faint but visible like scars. The crew chief, a sergeant named Munoz, approached. "She's good to go, Captain. Flew like a dream on the test hop." Voss nodded. "Thank you, Sergeant. You did incredible work." Munoz shrugged, but he looked pleased. "It's what we do, ma'am. Besides, this bird's got a reputation now. Can't let her sit on the ground." Voss climbed into the cockpit, settling into the seat that had become more familiar than any home she'd ever known. She ran through the pre-flight checklist, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Everything checked out. She started the engines, and the familiar rumble filled the cockpit, a sound that was part roar, part purr, entirely reassuring. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and she taxied to the runway, Akafor falling in behind her as Gator 2-1. The mission was routine. Another combat air patrol, another set of coordinates, another day of watching over soldiers on the ground who depended on them. But as Voss lifted off, the wheels leaving the tarmac, she felt something shift inside her. The sky opened up above her, endless and blue, and for the first time in a long time it didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like home. They flew in formation, 2 A-10s cutting through the morning light, their shadows racing across the mountains below. Voss checked in with the ground controller, received her tasking, and settled into the rhythm of the mission. Everything was smooth, professional, unremarkable, and that was fine. Not every flight had to be a fight for survival. Not every day had to be a test. Sometimes you just flew. Akafor's voice crackled over the radio. "Widow 7, you doing okay up there?" Voss smiled just a little. "Yeah, Gator, I'm good." And she was. Not healed, not whole, but good enough to keep going, and sometimes that was all you needed. The weeks turned into months, and the story of Widow 7's emergency landing became part of squadron lore. New pilots heard about it during their orientation. Veterans referenced it when teaching damage control procedures. And somewhere in a Pentagon office, a report was filed recommending Voss for a medal. She didn't think much about it. Medals were just metal, and metal didn't keep you alive. What mattered was the flying, the mission, the quiet satisfaction of bringing everyone home. Braddock called her into his office one afternoon. She stood at attention, wondering if she'd done something wrong. He gestured for her to sit. "At ease, Captain, this isn't a reprimand." Voss sat, still wary. Braddock leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I'm putting you in for the Distinguished Flying Cross again." Voss blinked. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "Your job was to complete the mission," Braddock said. "You did that, and you saved a $30 million aircraft in the process. That's worth recognizing." Voss didn't know what to say. Braddock continued, "You're also being considered for a leadership position. The wing is standing up a new training program for A-10 pilots, and they want someone with operational experience to run it. I recommended you." Now Voss found her voice. "Sir, I'm not a teacher. You don't have to be. You just have to show them what right looks like. And you do that every time you fly." Voss thought about it. A training position would mean fewer combat sorties, more time behind a desk. But it would also mean passing on what she knew, making sure the next generation didn't make the same mistakes, didn't take the same risks unless they had to. It would mean something beyond just survival. "I'll think about it, sir," Braddock nodded. "That's all I ask." The meeting ended, and Voss walked back to her quarters, her mind churning. Change was coming whether she wanted it or not. The question was whether she'd resist it or embrace it. That night she found herself back in the canteen, sitting with Akafor and Rivera and a rotating cast of pilots who'd come to accept her presence. They talked about everything and nothing: missions flown, movies watched, plans for leave. Voss contributed more now, her voice part of the conversation rather than just an observer. Akafor noticed. "You know, you're almost fun these days," he said with a grin. Voss threw a balled-up napkin at him. "Don't push it, Gator." He laughed, and so did she, and it felt good. Later, lying in her bunk, Voss stared at the ceiling and thought about her husband. She wondered what he'd think of her now, of the pilot she'd become, of the life she was slowly building from the wreckage. She liked to think he'd be proud. Or maybe he'd just tell her to stop overthinking and get some sleep. Either way, she closed her eyes and let the exhaustion pull her under, and for the first time in years, she slept without nightmares. The medal ceremony came a month later. Voss stood in her dress uniform, feeling stiff and out of place, while a general she'd never met pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to her chest and said words about valor and dedication that felt like they were meant for someone else. The audience applauded. Cameras flashed. And then it was over, and Voss was left holding a small velvet box containing a piece of metal that was supposed to represent something profound. Akafor found her afterward, still in uniform, standing outside the building and staring at the box. "How does it feel to be a hero?" he asked. Voss shrugged. "I'm not a hero, I'm just a pilot who got lucky." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Akafor said firmly. "You earned that, own it." Voss looked at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, and she realized he was right. Not about being a hero, she'd never feel comfortable with that word, but about earning it. She'd fought for every second of that flight, for every mile, for every life that depended on her being better than the circumstances. That was worth something. "Thanks, Gator," she said quietly. He grinned. "Any time, Widow." The nickname had stuck, and Voss had made peace with it. Widow 7 wasn't just a call sign anymore. It was a reminder of where she'd come from, of what she'd survived, and of the people she carried with her every time she flew. It was heavy, but it was hers. The training program launched 6 months later. Voss found herself standing in front of a classroom full of young pilots, all of them eager and nervous and hungry to prove themselves. She recognized that hunger. She'd felt it once before, the missions and the losses and the hard-earned wisdom that came from surviving long enough to know better. She didn't have a speech prepared. She just told them the truth. "Flying the A-10 isn't glamorous," she began. "It's not fast. It's not pretty. But it's honest. This aircraft will take care of you if you take care of it. It will bring you home if you give it everything you've got. And on the days when everything goes wrong, when you're flying on one engine and a prayer, it will stay in the fight because that's what it was built to do. Your job is to be worthy of that." The pilots listened, rapt. Voss continued. "You're going to make mistakes. Everyone does. The key is learning from them before they kill you or someone else. Ask questions. Study the aircraft. Respect the mission. And remember that the soldiers on the ground are counting on you to show up when it matters most. Don't let them down." It wasn't eloquent, but it was real, and that was enough. Over the following months, Voss threw herself into teaching with the same intensity she'd brought to flying. She ran simulations, critiqued flight maneuvers, and told stories from her own experience that illustrated the principles she wanted them to internalize. Some of the students were naturals, others struggled. But all of them respected her, not because of her rank or her medals, but because she'd been there in the cockpit when everything went to hell and she'd made it back. One student, a young lieutenant named Karis Mbala, reminded Voss of herself: quiet, focused, driven by something deeper than ambition. Voss took her aside after a particularly rough training sortie. "You're holding back," Voss said. Mbala stiffened. "Ma'am, I flew the profile exactly as briefed." "I know, that's the problem. You're flying by the book, but combat isn't in the book. You need to trust your instincts." Mbala hesitated, then said, "What if my instincts are wrong?" Voss smiled faintly. "Then you learn, but you'll never know if you don't try." It was advice she wished someone had given her years ago. Mbala took it to heart, and over the next few weeks, Voss watched her grow bolder, more confident. It was like watching a younger version of herself, and it filled her with something she hadn't expected: hope. The program was a success. The first class of pilots graduated with high marks, and several were assigned to combat squadrons where they quickly proved their worth. Braddock called Voss into his office again, this time with a smile. "You've done good work here, Captain. The wing commander is impressed." Voss nodded. "Thank you, sir." So impressed, in fact, that he wants to expand the program, and he wants you to lead it as a major. Voss blinked. A promotion. She'd been a captain for nearly a decade, long enough that she'd stopped expecting to pin on the next rank. Braddock slid a pair of gold oak leaves across the desk. "You've earned this, Voss, multiple times over. Congratulations." Voss picked up the insignia, feeling the weight of them in her palm. "Major." It felt significant, like crossing a threshold she hadn't known existed. "I don't know what to say, sir." "Say yes," Braddock replied, "and keep doing what you're doing." The promotion ceremony was small, just Braddock and a few other officers, but Akaffer showed up uninvited, grinning like a fool. He saluted her afterward, exaggeratedly formal. "Major Voss has a nice ring to it." Voss rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. "Don't make me regret this, Gator." "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." Life settled into a new rhythm. Voss still flew combat sorties when the mission required, but more and more, her time was spent in the classroom, on the flight line, shaping the next generation. She discovered that she liked teaching, liked the challenge of breaking down complex maneuvers into something understandable, liked seeing the moment when a concept clicked in a student's mind. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to heal, not from the loss of her husband, that wound would never fully close, but from the isolation she'd wrapped around herself like armor. She let people in a little at a time. She went to the canteen without needing an invitation. She accepted a drink when offered. She even laughed, really laughed, at Akaffer's terrible jokes. One evening, sitting outside under a sky full of stars, Akaffer asked her, "Do you ever think about what comes next?" "After the Air Force?" Voss considered the question. "Sometimes, but I can't imagine not flying." "You could fly civilian," Akaffer suggested. "Cargo charter, something like that." Voss shook her head. "It wouldn't be the same. Flying matters here. It means something." Akaffer nodded. "Yeah, it does." They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars, and Voss thought about legacy. What would she leave behind when her time in the cockpit was finally over? Not medals or commendations. Those would gather dust in a box somewhere. But maybe, just maybe, she'd leave pilots who flew a little better, who survived a little longer, who carried forward the lessons she'd learned the hard way. That felt like enough. Years passed. Voss eventually made lieutenant colonel, then full colonel. She commanded squadrons, shaped policy, and became one of the most respected voices in the A-10 community. Her call sign followed her, a badge of honor that never lost its meaning. Widow 7. The pilot who'd flown a dying aircraft home and landed it with nothing but skill and determination. Young pilots heard the story during their training and looked at her with a mix of awe and reverence. She tried to downplay it, but the legend had a life of its own. One day, late in her career, Voss stood on a runway at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, watching an A-10 demonstration. The pilot was Karis Mbala, now a captain herself, flying with a precision and confidence that made Voss's chest tighten with pride. The aircraft roared overhead, low and loud, and Voss felt the familiar thrum of the engines in her bones. She'd flown her last sortie 2 years ago, a decision that had come easier than she'd expected. There was a time to fly and a time to let others take the stick. But standing there, watching Mbala in the sky, Voss realized she was still part of it. Every pilot she'd trained, every lesson she'd taught, every story she'd shared, they were all still flying in a way. Her legacy was airborne. Akaffer, now a lieutenant colonel himself, stood beside her. "You miss it?" he asked. Voss smiled. "Every day, but I'm okay with that." He nodded. "For what it's worth, you were the best of us." Voss looked at him, surprised. "That's